Okay, hi guys. This is an academic and mental preparation presentation for exam season, and my name is Lindsay. I am the Student Learning Support Consultant on campus for USP 2024. Let's get started. So this is the agenda for today's presentation. First, I'm going to talk about effective study and what that means. And then we're going to go through memory and enhancement techniques and different strategies that you can use to improve your memory retention for exam season, because most of the exams that we offer here at USP are closed book into the exam room with you. And then we'll be talking about time management and planning, which is a really, really important part of exam season, particularly during your revision stage when you're going through all of your course notes and things. We'll go through some key things to discuss there. And then finally, I'll round it off by showing you a couple of different note-taking applications and organization skills to use when you're creating your revision notes for exam season. Yeah, let's get started. So first things first, effective study, what does it mean? Sounds like one of those buzzword terms that we just sort of throw around, but it actually has a pretty technical meaning, and it goes to the kind of learning that we're doing when we're undertaking study. So when we think about studying and learning, there are two main types of learning. There's passive learning and active learning. So passive learning is what we're doing when we're sitting in class or sitting in a presentation, listening to somebody else talk. It's very information centered, wherein the learner is receiving information from an external source. So it could be me as a presenter or your teacher during a tutorial or a video or whatever the case may be. And your role as the learner in that scenario is quite passive, versus active learning, which requires you to exert a little bit more brain power, and you're actually doing something to analyze the information that's being presented rather than just passively absorbing or listening to it. So it's more learner-centered rather than teacher-centered in the way that passive learning is, and you're taking on that active role in the learning by processing that information rather than just relying on the source of the information. So as I said, for passive learning, some examples include attending tutorials, highlighting materials in a textbook is also an example of passive learning, and rewatching recorded lectures where you're just watching a video. Those are all examples of passive learning, whereas active learning methods, you might see things like using flashcards, the act of actually writing out the things that you need to learn onto a flashcard, and then utilizing the flashcard method to learn that content. That's an example of active learning. Doing practice exams or quizzes, so learning information and then having to apply it in a direct context. That's an example of active learning. Or engaging in study groups where you're having discussions with others and you're disseminating the content yourselves and having that discussion. Those are all examples of active learning methods. So we can see that the two are quite different. What are the pros and what are the cons? So the pros of passive learning is that it's good for learning new content, which is why we structure the courses the way that we do, in that when you first learn content, it is usually in the form of a tutorial or a recorded lecture where you watch that content and you're learning that information for the first time passively. It's easier than active learning because obviously you're not taking as big a role in the learning process during passive learning, so it is easier. And it allows for short-term memory retention. So if you need to learn something in the short term, listening to something or watching a video can be a really good way of doing that. Whereas the pros of active learning is that it's better for long-term retention of information. So if we need to remember things for exams, for example, active learning tends to be the better way to go because we have better memory and learning retention over long term with active learning. It also boosts your critical thinking. It's not as easy, so you have to put some effort in, and that effort translates to critical thinking skills. And it also can be tailored to your particular style of learning, whereas passive learning tends to be a lot more monotonous and it's not able to be tailored as much as active learning. The cons, passive learning, you're not as likely to promote long-term retention. So something that you learn via passive learning isn't likely to be stored in your long-term memory without doing something to put it there. And it also relies on an external source, so that video or your teacher or me or whatever the case may be. Whereas the cons with active learning is that, as I said, it's a lot harder than passive learning because you actually have to put some effort in to take an active role in the learning process. And it relies on your own level of discipline and engagement with the content. So active learning is only as effective as you yourself make it as the learner. Okay, so now we're going to go through, have a discussion about memory and go through some different memory enhancement techniques and strategies within each of those techniques that I can suggest might help for revision for exams. So first, what is memory? We're going to discuss all the different types of memory, of which there are 4. So we've got sensory memory, short-term memory, working memory, and long-term memory. You can think of this as like a timeline. Information comes in and starts at sensory memory, goes from sensory to short-term memory, then goes from short-term to working memory, and then finally we lodge something in our long-term memory. But what does all this mean? So with sensory memory, the brain is receiving incoming information from sensory input. So that's our noses, our eyes, our touch, our ears, our senses. And our brains are constantly receiving, millions and millions of inputs of sensory memory, sensory information every single minute of every single day. So all of that information is processed into the brain in the short term, and our brain decides whether or not it is information that we need to keep or if it's information that we can ignore. So for example, when you're walking down the street and you hear a conversation from 2 other people who pass you, that's sensory information that is going into your sensory memory, and your brain will probably hear that information, determine that it's a conversation being had between 2 strangers, and immediately forget what they were talking about. So that's an example of sensory memory. Another example might be that you're in a small room with a couple of people and somebody farts or something like that. That's something that you'll be able to smell and your brain will register that has happened. And it might be something that gets stored in the short term because you make fun of your friend for farting in a study group or something like that. So then we have short-term memory, which is when that incoming sensory information has been sorted by our brains, gone through that process, and our brains have decided, yep, we're going to retain this information, at least in the short term. So it goes into our temporary storage. So with that information being held in temporary storage, it's in an active, readily available state for a short period of time, which varies depending on the type of information and how effective your memory is. But we're not talking about a very long space of time at all. 24 hours is a pretty good cap to put on the short-term memory. So then you have working memory, which is kind of similar to short-term memory, except that sensory data is being put into temporary storage for the purposes of then processing it or manipulating it rather than just simply holding onto it for a short period of time. So this might be, for example, a phone number that you need to remember to then make a phone call a couple of hours later or a little bit later on. That's an example of using your working memory. So something that's being put into your short-term memory just for the short term so that you can use that information or manipulate it in some way and process it. But again, not long-term. And then finally, we have long-term memory, which is when information is retained into our short-term memory and processed by the brain in a meaningful way. So you've learned the information or you've done something to the information that means that it's converted into permanently stored information. And that takes a lot of different forms. So those are the different types of memory in a nutshell. How does this all work? Picture that memory is like a computer screen. I think this is the best way to think about this concept. So the information our brains have just received via sensory inputs is like information that's displayed on a computer screen. While it's fresh and while it's on the screen, that information can be on the screen. That information can be viewed and recalled by our brains. That's how it works on a computer. While the information is on the screen, you're able to see it, read it, do whatever. That's all fine. but it's not going to stay on the computer screen forever, just like information on our computer screens won't stay there or won't be permanently accessible unless we make it permanently accessible. So unless we do something to that information, download it, store it in the computer, it's going to be discarded when our computer turns off. And we can no longer recall that information. The same way our brains won't be able to recall information if it hasn't been downloaded, so to speak, or stored from short-term memory or from sensory memory or from working memory into long-term. So in other words, our brains undergo a process to convert the stuff on the screen from temporarily stored information into permanently stored information that is saved into our brains and able to be recalled at a later time. So like I said, you can think of this as like a timeline. So we start with sensory inputs. We receive a huge amount of data of different types into our brains from all of our senses. And that information all has to be processed by the brain. And then that massive volume of sensory information is processed by our brains and sorted into those two categories, keep or discard. And then short-term memory kicks in, where that information that is sorted into the keep category is saved temporarily and able to be recalled for a short period of time. And we have the subset of short-term memory, which is working memory, working storage, where short-term information is saved and manipulated to be used in some way beyond just simple recall. And then finally, long-term storage. That's the last stage of memory. Information has been moved from temporary to permanent storage and is able to be recalled for longer periods of time because that information has been saved, so to speak. So what does this mean in the context of exams? Do we want something to be in our short-term memory, in our long-term memory? What's the go? I think it's helpful to understand the forgetting curve when it comes to exams because our retention of information invariably drops over time. So something that we've learned, unless we've done something to commit it to long-term storage, we will forget it very, very quickly. And the forgetting curve really effectively shows the way that that works in our brains. So we learn something, and within one day, our chance of having recalled that information without doing anything else to boost its retention in our minds drops to, between 80 and 90%. Within 2 days, it's dropped even further to around 40 to 50%. And 3 days after we've learned the information, we're looking at lower than 20% chance of retention of that information. So it really does highlight that it's important to commit something to your memory or actively take a part in retaining information because your brain is not going to just remember that information on its own. Like I said, the chance of retention goes down pretty quickly, and the forgetting curve suggests that we'll generally only remember 50% of information after an hour, 70% of information after just 1 day, 24 hours, and then by the end of a week, 90% of that information could be gone. So unless we put in some specific effort to remember the information and retain it for longer. Which is what we're getting to now. So how do we do that? How do we better commit information to our memories for exams? Because it comes time to exams, we have to remember all of this content that we've learned throughout the semester. How do we do that? There are lots of different strategies that have been proven to help with memory enhancement and retention for exams. So I'm going to be looking at 3 different methods today, and each of the methods have a bunch of different strategies that we're going to talk about that you might be able to use for your exam revision. But I just want to note that learning is a very personalized thing. Some people learn best via reading, some people learn best via doing, some people learn best via, everyone's brain works differently. So you should employ a strategy and a combination of strategies that works and suits your particular style of learning. Okay, so these are some of the strategies and methods that we're going to talk about. So there's a few there, and you'll notice that there's a bit of crossover between some of these strategies and some of these methods. That's just the nature of memory retention methods. They tend to share the same sort of principles. Okay, so self-testing methods. The first one we're going to look at is the reward strategy. So this is the technique that links the retention of information to receipt of a reward. Now, if you've got a pet, you know that the best way to teach your pet a new skill, like a dog, is to offer them treats. And when they perform that task, to give them a treat so that they associate performance of that task with the receipt of a treat at the end. And unfortunately, our brains are not so sophisticated that they're too different from our pets, and our brains are also reward motivated in the same way. So they seek out activities and experiences that will produce positive responses, like the release of dopamine. So dopamine is the chemical that our brains produce when something that we like happens or something happy occurs. So we can sort of hijack that chemical reaction in the same way that we do with our pets, to program our brains to recall information in exchange for some sort of reward. So to best employ it as a study technique, it's usually done in conjunction with another method. So for example, flashcards or speech retention or something like that, where you're let's take flashcards for example, you're give yourself a target to remember 20 or 30 or even just 10 flashcards, the content on the flashcard, and then you get to reward yourself with a small treat, which could be something as small as, a 10-minute break during a study session, or it could be a bite of a chocolate bar or something like that. It's important to do everything in moderation and not to over reward yourself, because our brains do get bored and demotivated if they think that the challenge is too easy. So they're not so committed that they will keep retaining information if it's no longer presenting an appropriate chemical response. So we're not getting that satisfaction of having completed a challenge to then get the reward. So just keep that in mind. There's a meme there. Study for 10 minutes, reward self with a 2-hour break. That probably isn't the right ratio to employ when it comes to the reward strategy. Okay, another self-testing method on its own is just the flashcard strategy. So this makes use of flashcards to stick information into our brains. Now, the reason why this one is so effective is because the act of writing out a flashcard in of itself, or writing out information, is proven to help with imprinting that information into our brains, which is why when you're undertaking your studies, it's so helpful to take notes during the tutorials or during the classes that you go to, because that act of writing out the information is going to help you remember it. You've taken an active role in the learning in that scenario, and you've gone from passive learning, just watching a video or watching a lecture, to active learning by actually writing it out. So the ability to physically see a fact or a piece of information written out promotes better active recall of that information in our brains. You can use flashcards to test yourself, just an example that we just discussed before. It also helps doing it this way. It also helps you to identify the facts and information that you do recall easily versus those that you don't, and you need to apply more conscious effort. So what I mean by that is, when you're going through your flashcards, if you see, for example, you've written definitions on one side of the flashcard and the term that you're defining on the other side. If you can look at a term and immediately recall the definition, that tells you that you've got pretty good recall of that information already. Whereas if you look at a term and you have no idea what it even refers to, what it even means, or you've never heard of that term before, that's an indicator that you don't remember that information very well. So that's the way that flashcards can help us also be more self-aware about the areas that we need to conduct further study. So don't overdo it with the flashcards. That's why there's a meme there. Don't know, you should be glad if you bought an extra 100 pack of flashcards, or devastated that you have over 100 flashcards to study. So it usually works in smaller increments, like for example, topics. Okay, and the last self-testing method that we're going to go over today is the SQ3R strategy, which is a reading comprehension method that provides an efficient way to read and retain textbook materials. So what does this mean? So basically, how this one works is, when you're reading through your course content, so the lecture slides or readings or whatever the case may be, you're first just going to do a skim or a scan of that information to gain an understanding of the structure of the content that you need to remember. So you're not, at this early stage of the process, you're not actually trying to actively learn anything. You're just trying to get an understanding of what the structure is of that content that you're learning. So then once you've done that, you're going to go through and create headings or a note of the structure that you're supposed to be learning. And set yourself some questions or some goals that you want to accomplish whilst you're doing your proper read through. So that survey and that skim is for the purpose of identifying what are the key learning outcomes here, what are the key things that I need to learn for my assessment or for my exam or whatever the case may be. So you might want to utilize the headings, the summaries, the learning objectives that are in particular resources already. But you formulate these questions that you want to be answering and looking for the answers to whilst you're undertaking step 3, which is to do a proper read through. Now, the reason why this is so effective is because instead of just blindly reading something and trying to retain everything, you're giving your learning some structure. So you're saying, okay, these are the questions that I need to find the answers to whilst I'm conducting my reading. And then your learning is a lot more directed in that way. So whilst you're undertaking step 3, which is a full read through, you're actively looking for the answers to those questions that you've set yourself. And then once you've finished your read through, step 4 is to recite the answers that you've learned from your read, the answers to the questions that you've set yourself. And this is also employing the testing method because you're trying to actively recall the information that you've just learned. And then stage 5 is when you go through and check that the answers that you've given are correct, and then testing yourself how well you can retain that information a few days or a few hours later. And you can gradually increase the amount of time from which you undertake step 4 to undertake step 5, depending on how much time you have between learning it and the reason that you need to retain it, which is your exam. So that is the SQ3R method. Now we're moving on to visualization and association method. And this strategy is called the Mind Palace strategy. And it's one of my personal favorites. I think it's really awesome the way that our brains work and are able to do things like this. So this is a technique that uses visualizations of familiar spatial environments, so familiar spaces, in order to enhance the recall of information. So how does this work? What does this mean? If anyone has seen Sherlock, they might know what I'm talking about here, but essentially how it works is this technique involves memorizing lists of facts, events, information by first mentally visualizing the layout of an area, so geographical area or space, and then mentally navigating through that area. So it works the best when you've picked an area that you know really well. So it could be here on the USP campus, it could be your house at home, it could be your favorite beach. That's maybe not a good example, because the idea is that you attach bits of information or concepts to different objects or area or spaces within that area. So let's take an example and say that I need to learn all the colors of the rainbow, and I'm going to use my bedroom to do it. So I would look at my lamp and I would think the color yellow. I would look at my wall and I would think the color blue. I'll look at my bedspread and I'll think the color pink, so on and so forth. I'm attaching the different aspects of information that I need to remember in this sequence. So, and then when it comes time to recall that information, all I have to do is revisualize that space and remember the associations that I've attached to different objects within the space, which is why it's so important that you pick a space that's really familiar to you so that you can easily recall or visualize that space. So that's why it says you might visualize your house in your mind and then attach different facts or information to different objects. Houses are great because they've also got rooms, so different rooms could be associated with different topics. And then within those rooms, you've got different items that you can use as prompts to remember certain bits of information. And the reason why Sherlock is on there is because this is something that he does in the TV show. So. Okay, the storytelling strategy, which is pretty similar. It's a technique that encodes facts and information the same way, except instead of visualizing a space, we are encoding the information within a story that we've remembered or a story that we've created to help us remember them in a more engaging way. So, by crafting a story that features all of the words or information we need to remember, we provide our brains with a more engaging way to retain that information and increase the likelihood of successful recall. So, for example, if I wanted to remember some historical facts about the order in which all the countries became involved in the Second World War. I know that there's a whole list of countries, but it's going to be hard for me to remember all of those countries and the order that they got involved. So there's Japan and China, Germany, Poland, Britain, France, Russia, and Italy. The chances of me remembering that list in order as is much lower than if I were to encode that information within a story, which is exactly what I have done. So what I've done is come up with an association or a character that I can put easily to the associated country. And I've crafted a story around the character or association for each country to remember the order. So a crane was squashed by a fat panda who really liked schnitzel. Those three underlined words represent Japan, China, and Germany. And I've picked those specific words because those are the countries that I think of when I hear those words. The schnitzel-loving panda knocked over a big pole in the kitchen, scaring the swans and the frogs. So that represents Poland, Britain, and France. And again, I've picked those specific objects or characters or associations because they carry meaning to me in relation to those countries. Then a large bear decided to try and eat them both, wearing big boots. And those last two relate to Russia and Italy. So if I was to remember the story, which is much easier than just remembering the list of countries, I have a much greater chance of retaining that information, i.e. the order in which countries entered into the conflict during World War II. So that's an example of storytelling or episodic memory. So the meme here is appropriate because you are really good at binge watching things on Netflix. If that's something that you tend to do while procrastinating, you could even use an episode, your favorite episode of a TV show, and encode certain bits of information to specific events. And that's something that you're much easier able to recall than just those events on their own or those facts on their own. So it's, again, can be personalized depending on your specific learning style. Okay, now we're going to the devices method. This one is a little bit more crossover in these methods because this is a technique that kind of creates a shortcut in our brain for recall of specific information. We've been doing this since we were all in primary school, and I'm going to show you why. So the mnemonic strategy places information into a specific sequence that has been put in a way that triggers the information. So for example, placing all the letters of the alphabet into a song to make it easier. We all learned the alphabet song when we were very little, and we've all remembered it ever since to remember the alphabet. So that's an example of a mnemonic. The most effective mnemonics are those made personal to you and your learning style. So for example, if you struggle to remember information, but you're really good at remembering song lyrics, that could be a good option for you. If you're good with creating rhymes and remembering rhymes, that could be another option. Or if you like writing poems, acrostics, things like that, that's another option to give yourself abbreviations to remember certain information. So acrostics and acronyms are both types of mnemonics, and I'll show you some examples of both of those to understand how that works. So this mnemonic uses the first letter of each word in a list to form a word or a phrase, depending on if it's an acronym or an acrostic. So it can be helpful for remembering large chunks of information by associating it to a funny acronym or acrostic mnemonic. So the mnemonic is the method, and then acrostics and acronyms are different types. So for example, an acronym, a popular one that lots of people know is Roy G. Biv, which is a fake name that we use to remember the order of the colors of the rainbow. So each letter in that name corresponds to a different color. Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. That's an acronym. We also have acrostics, which is phrases, and each starting letter of each word in the phrase corresponds to a different piece of information. So one that I recall from my childhood was never eat soggy wheat bits. We've got NESW, and that's the way to remember the compass points. So never eat soggy wheat bits, north, east, south, and west. So you compile all the items that you want to remember in a list, and then from there you can either make an acronym or an acrostic out of it to help you remember by taking the first letter of each item on the list. If you don't need to remember things in a specific order, you can play around with the order of things to create an acronym that you find easy to remember. But if it does need to be recalled in a specific order, for example, a process or a timeline or something like that, then an acrostic is probably going to work better. So these are some more examples of acronyms that I think you should also remember for your exams. So when writing the answer to a short answer question or an exam essay, remember to KISS, which stands for Keep It Simple, Students. So we don't want to overcomplicate or write in big, unfamiliar terms when we're writing our exams. We want to use concise, clear, simple language. So we remember to KISS, keep it simple. The second one is Quan, which is question, underline keywords, answer the question, and note an example. So when reading the questions in your exam, you can remember this acronym to properly understand the question and answer the question during your exam. Another one of the device methods is the rhyming strategy, which can go hand in hand with both the acrostic and the acronym mnemonic methods. So if you make an acronym or an acrostic that rhymes, you're much more likely to remember it. And just in general, we tend to retain that information a lot better because it sticks in our mind a little bit more. So, for example, most of us would have learned this rhyme to remember the number of days in each month of the year. 30 days have September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31, but for February, which has 28 days clear and 29 in each leap year. So the way that we remember that is because the last word of the phrases rhymes, and we can easily recall these months have 30 days, these months have 31, and then obviously February's only got 20. Another example of mnemonics is this song that was released to remember all the countries of the world. So there are 195 countries in the world. That is a long, long list of countries to remember, but it's much easier done when it's in the lyrics of the song. So I'm going to demonstrate that with this example.
And now, the nations of the world, brought to you by Yakko Warner.
United States, Canada, Mexico, Panama, Haiti, Jamaica, Peru, Republic Dominican, Cuba, Caribbean, Greenland, El Salvador, too, Puerto Rico, Colombia, Venezuela, Honduras, Guyana, and still Guatemala, Bolivia, then Argentina, and Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Costa Rica, Belize, Nicaragua, Bermuda, Bahamas, Tobago, San Juan, Paraguay, Uruguay, Suriname, and French Guiana, Barbados, and Guam. Norway and Sweden and Iceland and Finland and Germany now one piece. Switzerland, Austria, Czechoslovakia, Italy, Turkey and Greece. Poland, Romania, Scotland, Albania, Ireland, Russia, Oman, Bulgaria, Saudi Arabia, Hungary, Cyprus, Iraq, and Iran. There's Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Jordan, both Yemen, Kuwait, and Bahrain. The Netherlands, Luxembourg, Belgium, and Portugal, France, England, Denmark, and Spain. India, Pakistan, Burma, Afghanistan, Thailand, Nepal.
Okay, you get the gist. It's a song that helps you recall all the countries of the world, and they've arranged the countries in a way that rhymes, so it's much easier for us to remember. It's also very catchy. Okay, so this next section of the presentation is about time management, stress management, and self-care, which are all really, really important things to keep in mind during exam season, before your exams, during your exams, and also after as well. So if you fail to plan in relation to these things, then you plan to fail. And that's in relation to how you manage your time if you don't have an accurate or a strategy for how you're going to manage your time leading up to the exam and during the exam. You're setting yourself up for failure. And also stress management, because it's unrealistic to assume that you're not going to get stressed at all during the exam season. So you should have some pre-prepared strategies and be aware of stress management techniques to manage that. So first things first, for time management, I would say study schedules can be the be-all, end-all of your exam season. It's really important that you prepare yourself a study schedule, especially if, like me, you have a tendency to leave all of your revision until the week before the exam like we're in now. So here are the 5 stages of setting up a study schedule. Step 1, list all the topics that you need to revise. Step 2, visualize your time. Step 3, compile study blocks once you've created some way to easily visualize that. Number 4, make sure that you budget time within your study schedule for self-care, because we aren't robots. And number 5, make sure and employ the discipline to stick to your schedule. So we're going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail. Step 1, list all the topics that you have to revise. So most of you will have multiple courses or papers that you need to sit final exams for, and there will be lots of different things that you need to cram into your study revision period and different topics to learn. Some of these topics you might have learned really well the first time around and might have retained a lot better than others, whereas other ones you might not feel so confident. So creating a list of all of your topics for each of your courses allows you to get an understanding of all the content that you do actually have to learn for the exams, as well as going through a process of prioritization to allow for focus on specific topics that you think are weaker than others. So things to remember in this regard: your lecturers will have provided some information about what you can expect in the final exam. If it's an announcement on Moodle about the final exam content, or throughout the course of the semester, as you learn different topics, they might have dropped little hints about what's going to be in the exam. So where you can, try to go through the announcements about your exam or the course content, the tutorials that you attended, to pick up these hints and figure out what might have already been ruled out of being on the final exam. For example, a lot of course coordinators only structure their final exams based on the content from week 7 to 13. And so you don't have to undergo a process of remembering everything from weeks 1 to 6, because they've already told you there will be nothing from those topics in your final exam, something like that. So make sure that you've reviewed all the information that your course coordinators have put out in Moodle to avoid doing something like that. Exam study period is not the time to be learning content for the first time, but revising what you have already learned and topping up your understanding in areas where information hasn't stuck as well. So if you're going through all your lectures and tutorials for the first time, good luck. But this is not intended to be the first time that you're learning this information, merely revision of that information. And on that, I would also just add that if you are learning the information for the first time, you are definitely going to have to undergo a process of prioritization to figure out what topics you will and won't have time to learn, because that's a lot of studying to be cramming into a short period of time. Okay, so then we have to go through a process where we visualize the time that we have available to be able to then divvy it up between our various courses, and then within the courses to our various topics. So finding a way to visualize your study schedule like this is, again, a very personalized thing, and it's something that depends on what works for you. So you might have a spare calendar at home that you're able to write up and allocate to specific days or topics or whatever. You might use, electronic calendars like Google Calendar or Microsoft or notes apps on your phone to do this, however works best for you. Some things to keep in mind: be sure to include the actual day of your exam onto your study schedule or your calendar. You shouldn't be planning on doing any final study topics on the day of your exam. That time should be spent preparing yourself for the exam. Getting a good night's sleep, eating a good breakfast, getting yourself hydrated, going for a walk, trying to release the stress from your body, and preparing yourself for 3 hours of sitting. You also want to budget time to actually get to the exam. So those are all things that you need to take into account when you're finding a way to visualize your time for the study schedule. You also need to be realistic about the actual time that you have available to study. So factoring into your schedule that you'll inevitably have to spend time doing other things like sleeping, like making food. You might have other obligations that you need to attend to in this time, like pets or children or church or whatever it is. Those things should all be factored into your study schedule as well. And you shouldn't be budgeting to spend that time on studying when you know that that's not a realistic outcome. Skipping out on planning those necessities will only impact your ability to follow rule number 5, which is actually sticking to your study schedule. So don't make your schedule too complicated either. Just keep it simple and easy to follow. You want to reduce the stress that you put yourself under during this exam revision period. So if you're struggling with thinking of a way to visualize your time, like in step 2, thankfully, USP has a free weekly schedule template on our website, which you can tailor and use for compiling an exam study schedule. So the way that it's laid out, you've got a day, each day of the week, and then hours from 6 a.m. to 1 a.m. in the morning. And I would not expecting you guys to be putting something in every single block of that day. Like I said, important to get a good night's sleep during your study period. So just allocating time within those blocks to study specific topics or specific courses. You might like to use a template that outlines specific topics and subjects to study, as well as key goals or outcomes to focus on. It's productive to think about your study blocks in terms of the objectives that you want to achieve. So, for example, I used to think about it in terms of the different topics that I'd like to be able to complete the practice quizzes for, or something like that. Color coding can be a really good way of visually keeping track of the allocation of your time on your study schedule. So if you were to utilize the weekly schedule, you might have a couple of different highlighters that you'd use for different courses, different topics. You might use the color coding system to allocate priority. So for example, if something's highlighted in red, it means, you know, you're anticipating it will be a bit harder or take you a bit longer, versus if something's in green, you're feeling pretty confident about it and you think that you don't need to spend as much time on that topic. So color coding can be a really good way to break up the information like that. And as well, you can color code to block out certain areas on your calendar that it's not available to allocate to any studying or not to a particular course. So once you have done this process, once you've prepared some sort of way of visualizing your study planner, it's time to do the allocation of different topics, subjects, or goals. Be specific about what you will study and when. And doing this makes you far more likely to adhere to your schedule rather than just saying, okay, from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m., I'm going to study. It's much more likely that you'll stick to your study schedule if you've said, okay, between 8 and 10 a.m., I'm going to do maths. Between 10 a.m. and 1 p.m., I'm going to do science, etc. Allocating your time to specific topics or specific goals. And this is why it's helpful to have undergone a process of prioritization, because you understand which topics will take more time or which topics will need more dedication and quiet or something like that, that you'll need to allocate it to a specific time period in the day. You should also arrange your study blocks so that they align nicely with the dates of your exam, obviously. So if you study the content for an exam 2 weeks before the exam itself, you might not retain a lot of that information when exam day comes around. So you want to make sure that the way that you study, you compile your study schedule aligns with your exam schedule as well. And of course, putting your exams on the study schedule too. You should limit each study block to 3 hours, and it's a good idea to take a break after that long period of time studying and refresh yourself. Otherwise, the quality of your studying is just going to suffer. And if you try to study in big long blocks longer than 3 hours, you're less likely to undergo that effective study that we talked about at the start of the presentation. It's more likely to turn into passive learning that isn't going to lodge as well in your long-term memory or your working memory as it will if you take a quick break. It doesn't even need to be a long break. It could be as short as 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes to just take a walk, stretch your legs, have some water, give your brain a break. It will do a world of good as far as continuing to study effectively. So make sure to budget those breaks into your study schedule as well. Okay, saving time for self-care. This is something that we all like to think that we can go without in exam season, but again, it's just something that sets you up for failure if you don't budget time to sleep and eat good food and fill up your happy cup. Then your study is going to suffer. It won't be as effective as if you are properly motivated, fully rested, well hydrated, and fed. So it can be tempting to skip out on these things to get more time to study, but if you think that the trade-off is worth it and the quality of your study might drop, then that's just something you'll have to decide. It's vitally important to observe good self-care practices during exam season, or it will have a negative impact on your physical and mental health, and your stress levels are more likely to increase. And in general, your condition is going to be deteriorated than it would if you took good care of yourself. So good self-care practices needs to be balanced in order to have good exam performance, in my opinion. Okay, one important aspect of self-care during exams is stress management. So we've talked a bit about time management and what our golden rules are there, but let's talk about stress management. So some important management strategies for stress management include getting 8 hours of sleep, like I've just said, taking short breaks to break up your study blocks, making sure that you're keeping on top of your self-care to continue effective study. You might feel some mental strain or even physical strain, and these things can be worked out both through physical strain can be worked out by doing stretching or like physical exercise, going for a walk or something, and mental strain can be counteracted by breathing exercises, mindfulness exercises, and just plain on taking a break. Dehydration and dry mouth. These things are also symptoms of stress, and the way to manage those is to keep up your water intake and always have one of these water bottle handy. You should also plan to take one of these into the exam with you, albeit that it has to be a clear bottle. And nausea as well is another common symptom of stress, and that is counteracted by eating good, nutritious food and not junk food that doesn't nourish our bodies and give us the energy we need to get through this stressful encounter. So some things to keep in mind, some good self-care practices. This one in particular is a muscle relaxation series, so something that you can do just while sitting to try and work out some of the physical and mental stress that you might be feeling. So I'm just going to play a short portion of the video, but there's plenty of these online. You just find one that works for you or targets the particular areas that you might feel physical stress or strain.
Progressive muscle relaxation. Stress, whether you realize it or not, creates tension in the body. Patients with rheumatic diseases tend to have a lot of muscle tension, especially when trying to cope with the daily joint stiffness and pain. This next exercise, known as progressive muscle relaxation, involves purposely tensing and relaxing different muscles so you can more easily identify the difference between feeling tense and feeling relaxed. Just like the first exercise, the end goal here is to feel less stressed. Also, it's important to note that you should not engage in any of these exercises if you have pain in different parts of the body or distress or limitations. You should not be in any discomfort while doing these exercises, so please feel free to modify or eliminate any of the strategies as you see fit. Let's practice. Again, find a comfortable place to either sit or lie down. You can begin by taking a few deep, relaxing breaths. Let's begin by bringing attention to your feet. Curl your toes in tightly to feel the tensing muscles of the foot, of both feet. Hold this for a few moments before releasing the tension and relaxing the feet. Do you notice the difference? Noticing the difference between a tense and relaxed muscle is the purpose of this exercise. Now we're going to repeat this relaxation
and so on and so forth. So the video is linked on the slides if you want to access this particular one, but like I said, there's plenty of different variations of muscle relaxation techniques that you can look up online. Okay, rule number 5 is to stick to your study schedule. So like I said, study schedule is all well and good, unless it's unrealistic and you don't plan to stick to it. So the success or failure of your study schedule is all down to you and the methods that you put in place to plan and adhere to your schedule and the discipline that you apply. So some things that can help is to communicate with your friends and family and to let them know that you've got a study schedule in place and to set clear boundaries so that you're not being bombarded with messages or you're not tempted to divert from your study schedule in favor of spending time or doing things with your family and friends. Telling them about it is also a good way of holding yourself accountable, because your friends and family are going to want to support you and can help you with sticking to your study schedule. For example, if you tell them that you're planning on studying for the next 3 hours, and then they see you sitting on your phone an hour later, they might tell you to cut it and to go back to your studying. So it's a good way to help you stay accountable by looping those people into your study discipline process. Avoid any potential sources of procrastination during your study time by putting yourself in an environment where you're going to be able to effectively study. So you're not going to get very good study done if you're sitting in a cafe, your friends are coming in, and there's people going by, and there's lots of things happening that has the potential to divert your information. Similarly, you want to stay away from things like TVs or computers where you can get distracted doing other things than studying. Your cell phone, a lot of smartphones these days have settings where you can turn off the notifications, put your cell phone no disturb mode so that those notifications don't come through. Little things like that to set yourself up for success so that you stick to your study schedule. One thing that I liked to do when I was in university, I was very prone to picking up my phone and scrolling on TikTok, would be to instead set a timer on my phone so that every time I looked at it, I could see how long I had been studying. And if I'd set myself a goal of studying for 3 hours straight, I would see the clock, realize that I hadn't reached my goal yet, and be more motivated to go back to my studying rather than deviate and procrastinate doing something else. Give yourself specific goals to achieve along the way and reward yourself with your successes. So it's important to keep your happy cup filled. Like I said before, that's a part of self-care during the study schedule, during the exam revision period. So giving yourself specific goals to achieve and rewarding yourself with your success. Like I said before, it could be something as simple as a bite of chocolate or a little short break, or being able to pet your dog for 5 minutes, whatever something that would motivate you. It might be going for a quick swim for half an hour in the middle of the day between your study blocks or something like that. And finally, you're most likely to stick to your study schedule when you practice good self-care and balance, and you feel mentally and physically healthy and motivated, whereas not practicing good self-care, getting tired, getting hungry, getting thirsty, these are all things that have the potential to impact your ability to stick to your study schedule. So make sure that you stay on top of your self-care so that you don't become overworked, overwhelmed, or just plain overstudying on the whole. Okay, if there's no questions, I'm going to move on to the last section of the presentation. So this is just a quick one to run through some of the note-taking and organizational apps and tools that are available for you guys to use during your exam revision period. This is entirely dependent on how you undergo your study in the first place. So if you are the kind of person who tends to write out notes in your notebook versus if you're the kind of person who likes to type them out on a computer, whatever the case may be, I, as a student, used a couple of different note-taking apps, and so I just want to share some of the tips and tricks or some of the apps that I've discovered along the way that have been really helpful for structuring my studies and my studying techniques. So these are the 4 that we're going to talk about. I'm going to quickly go through Microsoft Word, which I'm sure you will all be familiar with by now. We'll talk quickly about Google Docs and some of the functionality that makes Google Docs really helpful for exam revision. OneNote, which is kind of like an electronic notebook. So if you're the kind of person who likes to have different notebooks for different subjects and likes to write out all of your notes and have pages and sections and whatever, well, OneNote could be a really good electronic note-taking method for you. And then Notion, which is slightly more high-tech than the others, super easy to use once you get the hang of it and can be very, very versatile. So I used Notion all the way through university, and I found it really helpful for organizing all of my notes both during the semester and then when it came time to exam revision as well. And if any of these particular apps seem like they could work for you, but you don't know how to use them or you want a bit more information, you can book an appointment in with me, Student Learning Support Consultant on the campus, by going to our Facebook page and clicking the link in our bio. You can book an appointment, a one-on-one appointment with me, and I'm happy to walk you through these apps in much more detail. But this is just a really high-level summary of some of the features that you might like for these apps in regards to your exam revision period. Okay, so the tried and true first option is Microsoft Word. It's a really good word processing app for collating all your notes in one place. And the main benefit of Microsoft Word is that you're able to use it offline. So you can do study even when you're not connected to Wi-Fi. You all have Microsoft Word as part of your Microsoft 365 package with USB. And if you don't know how to access this, reach out to me and let me know and I will show you. But you all have free access to this as students. And so it's available to you all online. And like I said, you're able to download documents into Microsoft Word so that you can access them even when you're offline. It's got really good basic built-in features for making notes and formatting. You can also put pictures and graphs and tables in there as well. And it's really intuitive and easy to use. So a lot of people will have already encountered Microsoft Word at some point or another throughout their professional career or in school or in university. Google Docs is really similar to Microsoft Word in a lot of ways. It's not as easy to use offline, so that's one of the cons of Google Docs as compared to Microsoft Word. But then one of the pros is that it's got some functionality that we really, really like and can make life a lot easier for us. So a lot of the same functionality as Word, you're able to put text and pictures and graphs and all that into one document or one place. But also making use of the headings functionality in Google Docs allows you to create quick links. So you can click on a heading in your table of contents and it will take you straight to that area of the document. It's also able to be shared a lot easier than Microsoft Word. You can just add each other's student emails to a Google Doc and share it amongst yourselves so that everybody can be working in the same doc at the same time. So I'm going to live example show you the headings demonstration. So what I said before about creating hyperlinks, to do that, you use the drop-down menu. We've got all these different text types, goes from normal, title, subtitle, headings, blah, blah, blah. So if you create a table of contents in Google Docs, and then you utilize these headings throughout your notes in that Google Doc, the table of contents will automatically pick up where there's been a heading put in, where there's been a title, so on and so forth. And it will format your table of contents so that when you click on that heading, it will take you to that location in the document. So it's really handy. You can create a quick and easy way to navigate through your through a Google Doc. So you insert your table of contents once you've put all your headings and things in, and then you select the third option, which has the hyperlinks. So you can see in the bottom corner here that there's a little hyperlink image there, a little symbol with 3 blue lines. That one is the one with hyperlinks. And once you've done that, you'll be able to click on the various different headings in your table of contents, and you'll also have that navigation bar on the side so that you can scroll through or quickly navigate through a big document with all of the notes from your course for the semester. Okay, OneNote is another really cool one. It's very, very similar to Microsoft Word. It doesn't quite have all the functionality of Microsoft Word, but it does trade off for having some cool features that make it seem like a notebook. And also, if you have a tablet, you're able to draw things directly into OneNote, whereas with Microsoft Word, you have to insert it as an image, and it's just a bit more niggly. So the OneNote is really cool in that way. It's also formatted to look like a notebook, so you can put lines on the page the same way that you would have in a regular notebook. You can set up different sections and pages within your different notebooks so that it mimics the style of manual notes, and it's really easy to use as well. So for example, this is what it looks like. You can see that in this notebook we've set up, we've got 4 different courses. And then for each course, we've got sections and pages. So the sections, you can see we've got topic 1 as a section on its own, topic 2. And then within those sections, we've got the pages or the lectures that we did within those topics. And then I've got a section at the top as well for exam notes. And it's super easy to organize all of my notes in one place and organize all of my courses if I'm taking 3 or 4 different courses in a semester. So, and as I said before, you can format it to look like a notebook, or alternatively, if you're taking a science subject and you need to draw graphs and things into your notes, there's grid lines there as well that you can use if you need to. And then finally, Notion. It's an online workspace and organizational tool that has pretty similar functionality in that you can set up different pages and databases within your notes, but it contains a lot more functionality than just word processing and note taking. This one is a little bit more complicated to explain in a nutshell. So if you're interested in learning more about how Notion works or getting help setting up for next semester, please come and make an appointment with me using our Facebook page. I'm happy to take you through it and show you live examples from when I used it in my study. But I find it really helpful for organizing lots and lots of different pages of notes. You're able to make databases within your Notion account. It comes preloaded with a whole bunch of different templates that you can use. Free templates that you can access from online that starts the setup process for you, basically. And it's also free for personal use and able to be accessed from any device. So I have Notion set up on my phone, on my laptop, on my computer at home, all of that sort of stuff. Okay, prep for exam day. What's involved? What should we be thinking of? First one, I've said this already, but I'm going to say it again. Get a good full night's sleep the night before your exam. It will make a world of difference. You're going to be sitting in that exam room for 3 hours. That's a long time to have to focus. So you need to make sure that you're well rested and you're not falling asleep at the desk. Eat a nice, hearty, nutritious breakfast to give yourself the energy that you need to sit there for 3 hours. It's also really embarrassing when you're sitting in an exam room and your stomach is the one grumbling super loudly and distracting everybody. So make sure that you've had something to eat for breakfast so that you have the energy that you need to get through the exam. Make sure that you bring plenty of water with you in a clear plastic bottle. It's important to keep hydrated. If you plan on having things like energy drinks or coffees, you can't take those into the exam with you. So water is your only go during the exam. And I would highly recommend that you take some water in with you. You are allowed to take a bathroom break during your exam period. So that's totally fine. Don't worry about that. Come prepared for your exam. Bring pens and all of that stuff with you. If you're allowed a calculator, for example, bring that with you. The worst thing in the world is when you show up to an exam and you don't have the equipment that you need, or you need to source a pen, and that's just added additional stress that's going to start you off on the wrong foot for your exam. Make sure that you also know your student ID number, because you should know your student ID number. And finally, make sure that you're on time for your exam, because I would hate for you guys to go through all of this preparation and do all of this study and then miss out by being late. So make sure that you know what time your exam is. If you're unsure, feel free to call us up or email us, and we'll be happy to tell you when your exam is scheduled for.